This is me, Fran, aka Fran Brands from London, and thank you for joining me live. I'm just going to add my friend to the chat. And hello, good
Hello,
morning.
you alright?
You can call me Susan because I am boiling. So hot. How are you?
Yeah, basically the same. I've got the fan. Does it sound okay? Is the
Yeah,
fan picking
I
up? Yeah,
can't hear the
okay,
fan
cool.
at all.
Lovely. Because I've got the fan on here. It's not if it's too harsh, it'll give me like a proper blowout, which is probably a bit too sexy for what we're doing this morning. So,
I know.
um,
I don't think my followers could handle that. But
no.
thank you for those of you who are joining us. For those of you who are watching this later, my name is Fran Ayala. I am also known as Fran Brands. I'm a brand strategist and stand-up comedian. And today I am joined by my friend Willow Marler. Willow is an award-winning animator and designer, and also an award-winning stand-up comedian. Because who the fuck needs to pick a lane? Am I right? Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do?
Yeah, so animator and designer is my sort of main job because stand-up comedy is not something that brings in money right now. It takes away money for premiere ins and trips to London Paddington, but we love it all the same. So yeah, that's the thing that I actually do for my main job is animator and designer. I do all sorts of different things, but I tend to focus on something called science communication or STEM communication. So that might be explaining certain scientific or mathematical principles, or it might even be telling stories that help to, explain or use certain psychom sort of science sort of stuff. Like recently, I did a project called Tappy Maths, which was a series of 4 songs for very young children, teach them certain maths concepts. So there's one about the idea of zero and all the different words that zero can be, that can mean zero, like naught and nil and whatever.
Mm.
There was one about rhythm, so the idea of fast and slow, speed. There was one teaching about different patterns that we use these like 2 different types of aliens going to school and sort of lining up in different ways, called the Gribbles and the Pops. And
I
there was
love
another
that.
and there was another one that was about a rectangle and all the properties of a rectangle, and you know, like for example, one of the things that when I showed my parents that they weren't aware of is that they were like, "That's a square," and I was like, "Yeah, square's the type of rectangle," and that blew my mum's mind. So even at her age, it was still teaching her something that was aimed at younger people, but is hopefully enjoyed by all people.
I mean, we can learn something every day. My question is like, did you always know that this is what you wanted to do?
Well, I've sort of you can see like a little preview, I suppose, of my surroundings. You can see here I've got lots of animate. This is my little desk here,
Mm.
and I've got all this sort of stuff on the shelves there, and posters behind me. So it's always been something that I've loved. Like I fell in love with the Pixar films from a very young age, and so I grew up wanting to be. The way that it worked is that when I was 10 years old, I got my first phone that had a camera on it, and
Mm.
so it was the Sony Ericsson W550i, bright orange. It was one that it didn't flip up; it twisted up, which was even more sort of naughty's craziness. Um, but
I
I
had a red
used that
one.
the same one.
Yeah, I had a red one.
Yeah. And it was also one where you could take off like the faceplate of it and replace it with a different color. So it wasn't even like a case; it was like taking the phone apart. Um, so I started making little videos on that with my friend Matt, and from there I started to sort of look at how to edit them together and do effects and things. And then from there, I learned animation. From there, I learned graphic design. And through all of this, I'm like, oh, I want to be a film director. No, I want to be an animator. No, I want to be a designer. And then I went back to wanting to be an animator. And I do animation and design. So that's what I settled on in the end. But it was based on, those very early years of watching Pixar films, watching Toy Story 2 particularly, The Incredibles, which is still my favourite Pixar film, favourite animated film. And my mum will always say that my skills originated from when she had me on her lap at the computer playing educational video games.
I love that.
And she'll always want to take a little bit of credit for that, which I think is fair enough.
So you are obviously very well versed in the visual sort of mediums that we consume content. Were you always like a visual learner, or were you always just like into expressing yourself through visual formats?
It's difficult because I think that when you sort of learn that I'm an animator and designer, you might picture that I was the sort of person that's always drawing or always painting, or I was always sort of filling in sketchbooks with that sort of thing. But that was more the sort of thing that my wife, who's an illustrator, that's the sort of thing that she used to do. Whereas I'd always sort of, when you grow up and you have these truths about yourself, like I'm just this or I'm just that, and the more you sort of learn that from either other people or telling yourself, you sort of grow up and end up fitting into that box, even if it's not necessarily true. I always was like, I'm bad at drawing. Like I can't draw. I never had that sort of motivation to improve, because my main method was always like on the computer. And so whereas drawing skills are really essential for being an animator and designer for obvious reasons, but I was always like, I really struggle with drawing. Now I can draw really well, and nowhere near as well as my wife, because that's her bread and butter, but certainly much better than I used to, and that's all because of practice. So I think I was a very visual person, but it was always sort of on the computer is where I'd sort of
digital.
Digital stuff was always my home, I suppose.
Yeah, you're not an old fart like me, like who just went very analog from the beginning. I actually drew quite a bit as well growing up. I drew a lot. And then in uni, when I studied visual arts and communications, they were like, "You like perspective, darling," and I'm like, "All right then." Okay, fine. All right.
Was that just that you just needed to learn how to do 3-point perspective and things like that? Or was it more of a wider thing of like...
It was more of like the style that I preferred. I was very like into two-dimensional art, like Matisse, Gauguin, like things that like kind of like just fucked with like your perspective, but like also like looked quite flat, because I loved cartoons. I was always into cartoons. So anyway, what I was gonna say is like, how do you actually like get into this industry? My husband's gonna come through the door.
It's one of those industries that people say, do I need to go to university for this? And I did. I went to Birmingham City University. I studied visual communication. Is where I met my wife, because she also studied visual communication, but she did the illustration strand. I did the animation strand. Okay. And in the second year, there was a group project where people from different strands worked together, and that's where we started to get to know each other more, and that's where, everything started. But I also know plenty of people that didn't go to uni, or that went to uni and dropped out, and but are just still as sort of successful, and they've carved their own path. So I think that the way that you get into it, it's such a cliche, but it is, when you want to sort of make connections and get work and stuff, it's always about like who you know. It's also not just about who you know, but then when you do a project, is wanting to sort of being remembered positively, meeting deadlines, being nice, being just a nice person. And I think a lot of these cross over with comedy as well, is if you're known to be someone that is flaky and doesn't turn up for gigs that you're booked onto, or that's a bit of a, bit of a nasty character or whatever it is, no one's going to want to book you, because people are like, oh, don't get that person. They were, they turned up late, and they were lazy or whatever it was. And it's the exact same with creative jobs. Is, you know, it's very much about, because if you, especially if you're freelance, then you're always the one that's having to sell yourself. You know, you're always the one that's having to get the work, as opposed to your boss getting it for you. And so it's the pathway that you, there's not one specific way of getting into it. I always say that the most important thing, if you're wanting to get into any of these sort of, you know, visual arts or whatever it might be, is you've got to have the passion. And that's not to say that if you're like, oh, am I passionate enough? There must be something that's like set your soul on fire if you're wanting to even consider being an animator and designer. And it's sort of about pursuing that and wanting to make the most of that. So if, for example, like me, you are a huge Pixar fan or a huge Wallace and Gromit fan, or
Oh, nice.
there's plenty of people that obviously love anime. It's about sort of exploring, okay, well, why is that? Why do I love anime? What is it about, you know, these films, Pixar or DreamWorks or whatever else that that I love so much? And it's about then understanding how you can pursue maybe that area. And it's also about being open to the idea that, you know, you might want, for example, when I was younger, I was desperate to work at Pixar. That was my dream. And because it's sort of sold to you as this this haven of animation, sort of, you know, creative craziness where people are riding around on scooters and, you know, everything's sort of so wonderfully open and anyone can pick an idea for a film. And then you realize that that's actually not quite true, and is in some cases actually a very unpleasant place to work because of certain unpleasant characters that used to work there. And so it's about sort of also being open to, you know, having those dreams, but then those dreams could change, or, you know, wanting to adjust your, you know, as your tastes adjust, you can adjust your plans and think, you know, how to get into it.
True. So my question is then, I mean, you know, like animation is it's very grueling, it's very meticulous work, and you know, it's hard. It's hard, I think, like with any creative industry, especially right now. So like, what is the thing that you find most fulfilling about the work that you do?
I think it's a bit like comedy in that one of the most exciting parts of the process is the very early stage where you have that idea and you start to, your imagination runs wild with it, and you sort of think, oh, we could do this, or how, you know, like when you're thinking of I've got a new idea for a routine, we could do this, and, you know, you just imagine how you imagine yourself in that situation on stage doing the routine, and it's, you know, oh, they're finding it hilarious, or, you know, you get to do this brand new thing where you sing or you do beatbox or whatever it might be, that's sort of, you know, being playful with it. And it's the most fulfilling thing, I think, is just to see that come to life. Like, I always think of animation as, it is very hard. It's just bringing something to life. And it's not necessarily, you know, it helps to not get bogged down in the details of, oh, but what 3D program should I use? Or what type of, you know, stop motion material should I, whatever it is. It's like, it doesn't matter. You know, at the end of the day, if you're animating, if you're bringing something to life, and there's so many ways that you can do that. You know, I sort of think of like puppetry, almost like on-stage puppetry is almost, you know, where do you blur the line with like the Muppets? Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily consider them to be animated characters, but they still share a lot of characteristics with animated characters in the.
Well, they come from a world that's been created, that's been built from someone's imagination, and I think there's something to be said about, you know, I would say the difference between animation maybe and stand-up comedy, or just like any like visual sort of art, is that you kind of have no limit to what you can imagine, except like, you know, the skill that you have to bring that to life. I find that in stand-up comedy you're working within a lot of parameters because there's time constraints, you know, like the audience reaction also dictates your next move. But my question for you is like, what would you say are like the crossovers or the parallels?
Well, there's like one of the things in animation that was set out by some of the early Disney animators. There's something called the 12 Principles of Animation, and if you think about the early Disney sort of films, and yeah, a lot of that was related to like slapstick vaudeville like entertainers of you know, like Buster Keaton or you know, and of like Charlie Chaplin. So especially with like silent cartoons, because obviously it started off being, silent films. A lot of it was very visual and drawing on those sort of slapstick funniness. Um, and so by its very nature, they're sort of linked in that way. And so one of the principles of animation is timing. So, how long a movement lasts, and how that different, a slow movement versus a quick movement. If you imagine like a snooker ball, if a cue hits that snooker ball sort of quite gently, then it might be because they're trying to be very precise about that movement, and they're wanting to line it up, and they're not wanting to overshoot. Or maybe it's someone that's doing it and doesn't really know what they're doing and sort of is a bit nervous about getting it wrong. Whereas if it's sort of a really quick movement, it might be someone who's so sure of themselves, they've got that power behind it. And
Okay,
so
okay.
if you imagine, like, if you're wanting to embody a character on stage, and that's another thing, characters are obviously something that's obviously, certainly linked between animation and comedy. If you're doing a character act, then the way that you live that character on stage is something that can be changed by the way that you walk, like even just the speed that you walk. Like if that can communicate, for example, maybe the age of the character, or the sort of style of the character. If someone's sort of moving around very skittishly, then that might be sort of quite a nervous, neurotic character. Whereas if someone's sort of quite slow and smooth walking on stage, there might be someone that's more sure of themselves, and maybe is looking down on the audience and sort of feels like they're better than the audience. And so there is so much overlap with, because just keeping on character comedy, as an animator, you are having to act the characters out. You're having to embody these characters. Okay. And being a character comedian, obviously you're bringing something to life. You're bringing this character to life that didn't exist before, that isn't you. But even if you're not doing character comedy, there is that element of you are bringing this version of you to life. It's not quite the same as just getting on stage and being your 100% true self. You're still embodying a version of Willow or a version of Fran that is, slightly exaggerated maybe, or is, slightly different from the version of you that you are in sort of general conversation. Like the version of us that we're talking right now is not going to be the version of us on stage. And so we sort of apply certain techniques to bring that person to life and to match what we're trying to aim for with the sort of characteristics that we wanting to embody on stage. And yeah, we have to do the exact same thing with animation, because those characters don't exist without us bringing them to life.
Amazing. I actually have never looked at it that way. That's super enlightening. Thank you for the insight. Is there something that you believe that animation can do that maybe other forms of storytelling aren't able to execute as well?
Well, I think animation inherently sort of feels limitless in a way. I mean, obviously there'll be technical limitations, but take a company like Pixar, or even Leica as well, who do the films like Coraline and
yes.
Kubo and the Two Strings that you see here.
I saw that. That's a great one.
They pride themselves on sort of trying to push those technical limits with every film that they do anyway. But I sort of imagine it as it allows you to. I think it's so much more of a creative medium than, for example, live action film. And I'm sure there'll be someone whose passion is live action over animation that would be able to argue the opposite. But if you take, for example, the live action remakes of Disney films, like the Moana one that's coming out at the moment, I'm not going to lie, it looks terrible. It lacks that sort of whimsy that the original one has. The Rock, because if you think of the proportions of Maui, who The Rock plays, the sort of demigod, he's an exaggerated form. His visual on screen, his actual visual proportions and everything do not fit that of how a human can look.
Absolutely.
It's much wider face. Obviously, his torso's exaggerated and all that sort of stuff. And so, The Rock in the live action version just looks like The Rock in a wig. Like it does not have that same level of like creativity involved in it. It just looks like, yeah, The Rock has put a wig on, and we go from there.
So
And
you
so
kind of like look behind the curtain, like it's a bit too real when I guess like you're right. It doesn't kind of have that like fantastical,
yeah,
effect that Moana, the animation,
and
does.
there's a famous principle called the uncanny valley,
Mm,
where if we get like, if you imagine like super realistic, like real life, right, on this end, and super stylized on the other end, then our sort of level of affection for those styles starts, if you imagine really, really cute, really simplified,
yeah.
it starts off really high, and then as it gets more realistic, it sort of dips. But then there's a valley right here just before it gets to super duper realistic, where it's sort of realistic but not enough. So if you
Mm,
think about like early CGI, so again, to take The Rock as an example, he was just like a Scorpion King or something in
yes,
Mummy, and the CGI was famously terrible,
it
where
was.
it looked like him but not quite. And it's that sort of that gap, that uncanniness that gives us, as as animal brained creatures, that sort of thing of like, this looks wrong, there's something about this that looks wrong, so therefore
Mm,
might look sort of dangerous to us or something. It doesn't quite look
mm,
human, and so it gives us like a weird feeling. And so uh, when uh when we just accept and go fully stylized, then we don't have to worry about any of that, Whereas when you get to trying to be too realistic with things, then yeah, it just looks creepy. I mean, people can use that to their advantage. If you sort of, I can't remember the name of the person, but there's this comedian that sort of does, it's sort of like a character act, where I think in America, where they're on stage and their movements are so sort of robotic, and they're sort of like, the way that they speak is so like, ha ha, that's great, and it's sort of all these different elements that make it clearly like a sort of an android, or like an old school
okay.
animatronic that from like old school Disney parks and things. And that's someone that's deliberately chosen to be creepy for the purposes of being funny. And so, yeah, but if you don't know about that, it's very easy to fall into that uncanny valley if you're trying really hard to be really realistic,
Got it.
and don't quite get close enough.
So we've talked about like I guess what you love about animation, like what drives you to stay in, again, like a very kind of grueling and nuanced role. But what do you find challenging about it? What do you say is like the most challenging thing about the work that you do?
Well, it's there's one of the things that's most challenging, is also one of the things I love about it the most, is that I'm the way that I work is I cover so many bases. So I'm not just necessarily animating. I'm also like designing the things that I animate. I do, for example, sound editing. So sometimes that might be voiceover work. Plenty of comedians find work doing voiceover work because they're used to using their voices and possibly manipulating their voices for certain effects. But then also working on, if I get a script from a client, then I quite like to edit that script so that it fits a more like what I know to be an animated video script.
Hmm.
Storyboarding as well, so sort of initial sketches to lay out the foundation, like the beats of the story, to give a general idea of what's going to happen in the animation. And I actually have a sort of familial connection with storyboarding because my uncle, Adrian Marler, is a storyboard artist and has worked on like Wonka, the Timothy Chalamet film. He's worked on Under the Skin, the Double,
Wow.
so many different sort of films. And so he's very much like, I'm sure, one of the key reasons that I got into animation as well. He actually was also an animator on the film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the sort of
No
the mixed thing. So he was one of
way.
the he was what's known as an in-between artist, where the key frames, the key poses, was done by someone else, and then it was his job to put all the bits that linked each
Got
key. So if
it.
you imagine like a key pose like this, like a wave, one key pose the next key pose is that. He did all the bits in the middle. Really grueling work,
Okay.
and was the thing that made him realise he never wants to animate ever again.
Got
Whereas a
it.
storyboard artist, he's got a very good skill of being able to very quickly get someone's ideas that have been said to him on the page. He can get that down really quickly, and so he's very efficient, and that's why people love to work with him. So I like to do all these different skills, but the problem with that is that obviously that makes projects so much bigger and possibly sometimes more stressful because there's so many different more parts that I've got to manage. Another thing that's difficult about animation is just that it can be very tedious. You know, it's very, and I mean, this can vary depending on what type of animation you're doing. So the fact that I'm doing digital animation using digital tools means that by its very nature, the computer is helping me in a way, sort of like, for example, I'm not having to do those in-between movements because the computer's doing that for me. And whereas if I was doing hand-drawn animation, obviously that would be a totally different thing. Stop-motion animation, again, I'd be even more tedious having to move things and take pictures. But it still can be very, you know, you've got to think about, like, if you think about like a character that's really excited to see their friend and they're jumping up and down and they're waving and they're maybe shouting something or saying something, that in itself is so many different aspects. You've got the waving of the arms, you've got the jumping up and down, but also jumping up and down isn't just moving something up and down. It's, you know, bending the knees and sort of maybe lowering the shoulders and then bringing it up, bringing the neck up as well. And then the facial expression, and then the mouth, if they're saying something, the mouth has got to lip sync to what's being said. And so there's all these different aspects. So it takes a long time to do what is seemingly quite a simple shot. And so, yeah, that can be very daunting if I know that something complicated is coming up in my sort of tasks that I've got to do. So yeah, but you know, it's all as there's lots of aspects of comedy that are very difficult or very frustrating or whatever, but we do it because we love what we do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Would you say, or do you believe that there is like a common misconception that people might have about animation and design, and or?
One of the big ones, it's not sort of like some kind of massive revelation, but it is something that I think people don't quite realize, is that with animation, like take an animated film, the voice is done first. People don't necessarily realize this.
Oh.
The voice recording is done way in advance, and people animate to the voice recording. Some people think that it's one of these things that, like, with an animator's brain, it seems mad that people would think this, but I thought this when I was younger as well. A lot of people think that people in the, you know, like, say Tom Hanks with Woody in Toy Story, he's doing his best to match what the animators have done with the mouth movements. But it's the other way around, because Tom Hanks is just being Tom Hanks and acting in the booth. It's the animator's job to match that. So the voice comes first and then the animation matches that. I suppose a big misconception, I suppose, but also in the other way around, I suppose, in that people think it's harder than it is sometimes, is people assuming when I say I'm an animator, they immediately picture the sort of thing that my uncle used to do on Me Friend Roger Rabbit, where I'm hunched over a desk and I'm drawing every single frame. And it's not that. There's obviously loads of different aspects of it that make it difficult and make it tedious and take a long time. But nowadays, you know, the way that I work is using the computer tools, which means it's not as, you know, as monotonous as that.
Got it.
Yeah.
I want to shift now, I guess, into like creativity as like something that you actually work at, right? Because it's not like we're waiting for the inspiration fairy to descend upon us wearing her Doc Martens with her glitter, you know, because it's like creativity is our livelihood. And, you know, you can't just be like, no invoices today because the muse didn't text back, right? So what do you do when you're asked to contribute an idea, a creative idea, but you're just not feeling inspired?
Well, I think that on that note, actually, there's this idea that there are some people are creative, some people aren't creative, and one of my tutors at uni, Steve Chamberlain, he tried to sort of get us into the idea that he really dismissed that. He did not believe that creativity is something that you can teach, because it's you know, it's looking at things in a certain way. Creativity comes with certain skills. It's not some kind of inherent thing that you're either gifted with or you're not gifted with. It might be something that you just, like any skill, you know, you can learn how to solve a Rubik's Cube, even if it looks like something that, I mean, I'm saying this as someone that did do that you know, when I was about 16. But it's creativity is something that you can learn and you can improve at and be better at. And there is a book that I read recently, which I don't want to get the person's name wrong, so I'm just going to Google them. But I think it's Elliot Kaplan, whose book I read, called Joke Farming. And,
yes, I have that one.
So he's someone that worked on SNL in America. Elliot Callan, sorry. So Elliot Callan's book, Joke Farming, it was all about him, because of the nature of SNL. That was very much like, I can't just like say, oh, I wasn't feeling very creative today. You know, there is a deadline. They need jokes, and they need lots of jokes on a regular basis. And so he had to develop certain ways of working where he could just, you know, his brain could just get jokes written. You know, there might not always be the most incredible things in the world, but he was able to go through a meticulous process where he'd be able to, you know, whether it's like looking at things in a certain other angle, or taking things and mixing them with other things to create the funny joke. And so I think that one of the things that I do a lot is, you know, sometimes it does take just going, I'm going to get nothing done by staring at this for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
I need to do something else or look at it tomorrow. And depending on the schedule that I'm working with, obviously there's sometimes where I might not be able to do that. But if I'm like, look, if I take the day off, it's not the end of the world. And it actually will be better than if I'm just trudging along trying to squeeze some idea out, as opposed to if I just look at it tomorrow night, immediately it comes to me. And it's obviously the same with, like, I'm sure when you've written scripts for gigs and things where you're just really struggling to word a certain joke or a certain, how do I link this joke to then how do I move from this bit to this bit? You know, it's just not working. And then you're doing something else. You might be shopping, or you know, it's working in the back of your brain subconsciously, and then it just comes to you, or you just wake up, bolt upright, and it's there, it's done. And it's your brain doing all the work, but you're not actually actively sort of, you know, sat at your desk trying your best to get this thing to work. So I think knowing like when to step away from something really helps when you're having that creative block. I did see something, especially when it relates to comedy, where it is just like, and people use certain tools as well for this, like tools that are like word processors but don't have a backspace function, like a typewriter, where people just suggest just write everything that comes into your head, just write it as it is, as opposed to having that filter. It's like you're sort of thinking it in your head, and once it feels right, that's when you start typing it out. No, just forget that. You just type. And like Kimmy, who you've done a live with before, we had a video call doing a bit of writing together a couple of months ago, and where she was like, you know, my set is, I feel like I'm sort of just doing the same stuff over again, and I'm wanting to sort of branch out a bit. And part of that was just that very early mind mapping stage where you sort of think, okay, what sort of topics would you want to draw on? And then you sort of explore, well, what, you know, if you, for example, I did backpacking, you know, before I went to uni. Okay, well, what does that involve? You know, it involves the actual packing stage. Was there anything that you packed, that you took on that holiday or that trip that was unusual or was very specific to you, or that you later realised that, oh, it turns out that not everybody takes this specific item of luggage, or whatever it might be. Like, for example, because I live with cystic fibrosis, whenever I go abroad, I have to take my physiotherapy equipment. And in the past, that used to include a dial and a tube, which is like, you know, you can sort of think of that and think, you know, depending on who's looking at that in the sort of security X-ray scanner, might see that and think it's a component for a bomb. And so we had to have like a letter from my clinic explaining what that was, just in case. It never came up. It never got challenged. But that was obviously a very specific experience that I and not many other people in the world would have had. And so there's obviously there's a joke there, but often the jokes exist. It's just about you've got to dive in and explore, and maybe sometimes that's just having someone else say, "Have you ever thought of doing something?" You said this to me the other day that I thought was funny, and whereas you didn't even necessarily think of a specific joke. It's that you just said something in passing that, because of the way that your brain works, you unintentionally made it funny, or you did a pun or something like that. So having other people, bringing other people in if you can, that really helps as well. And like I say, just having time off as well, just to, instead of just staring at a blank page and getting nothing done.
So I agree wholeheartedly. I believe that sometimes if you're not getting it done on your own, then maybe it's time to get somebody who's not so close to the project or so close to the task, and then
or so close to you as well.
Well, yeah,
because we're starting to become friends, but I still don't really have a really intimate knowledge of your past sets. And so there might be certain things where you're like, oh, this could be good, but it just feels like the same old stuff that I did 7 years ago, whatever. Whereas if I was coming at it with that, I'm the audience member that's never seen you before, in a way, and won't necessarily be held back by those things that you're putting on yourself as I can't do that. I used to do that before. And so, yeah, people that, on as close to you as well, as close to the topic that you're talking about, or especially with what I do, a lot of what I talk about, being transgender and having cystic fibrosis and things like that, a lot of it comes down to, because it's not something that is actually a sort of observational comedy where, we all relate to this. You get what I'm saying about going to the shops and this thing that we all experience. Instead, it's sort of the opposite of I experienced this. I've got to explain certain details first, and then you can find it funny from there. Explaining the idea of what passing means. It means that you look masculine or feminine enough for people to not even realise you're trans. And then I can make puns based, wordplay on the word passing. And so, but sometimes it helps to have someone say, if I just made a wordplay on the word passing, because the word passing is I understand what that means in terms of being trans so intrinsically now, but someone else might have said to me, what does that mean? I don't find it funny because I don't understand that reference. Yeah. And we're part of a WhatsApp group where there's people sometimes that do things like sense checks, where they go, right, if I say this to you, do you understand what that means? This sort of cultural reference. And you'll have lots of people possibly saying yes, or going, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. And there's something that I learned a while ago that relates to this, called the curse of knowledge. And the idea is that once you know something, it's very difficult to remember how it felt to not know that thing. Yes. And so sometimes you have to remind yourself, especially if you're teaching people, whether it's through stand-up or through science communication animation videos, you need to remember that certain references and certain terminology, if you say them as if they're, because to you they might be second nature, but if you present them as such to other people, then they're going to be lost because you forgot that, not everyone realizes that. For example, if you were to take, we were talking about the misconceptions of animation and that sort of thing, a big misconception about being trans, they might see people, trans guys who go on testosterone and their voice gets deeper. You might not quite realise that going on estrogen doesn't have the opposite effect. And so trans girls or trans feminine people have to do voice training. They actually have to do the work to change their voice because hormones and chemicals are never going to do that because their voice has already dropped. And so, but that, if you know that, it's very difficult to remember that, people don't know that as an intrinsic thing. It's something that you have to teach. And so that's another way where having another person that isn't involved in the topic at all, doesn't have any knowledge of it, can be a stand-in for your audience member that similarly doesn't have any knowledge of it.
No, that's so true. Like you can't really unknow something, so it's hard to put yourself in that position where you're like, "Oh, how did it feel to not be aware of this concept of the situation?" Um, and like a sort of like adjacent, I guess, topic. One thing I'd like to ask is that, you've won lots of awards for your work as a designer, as an animator. You're placing as semi-finalists, as finalists, and you're winning competitions in comedy. How do you prevent yourself, I guess, from getting complacent? Like, what pushes you as a performer, as a comedian, to just keep working on it, to keep improving instead of being like, I'm just gonna give them the set that won.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that helps is competitions when it comes to creativity. They feel intrinsically different from competitions like the Olympics or something. Like Usain Bolt is the quickest person over 100 meters. Like that is a fact. Whereas, for example, recently I failed to get past the heats of So You Think You're Funny. And I've got lots of friends that got through to the semi-finals that are going to be at the Edinburgh Fringe. That's really exciting for them, and obviously, I'm really happy for that. But it's still, there's always that part of my brain that's like really gutted and really sort of envious that they got through and I didn't. And so, but you got to remind yourself that that's the opinion of, possibly a couple of people, possibly even one person that's looked at your act and for whatever reason has gone, I don't think that you are suitable for the next stage. And that might even be, who knows, maybe there was someone that was just so happened to have a very similar act that did well last year. And they sort
Mm.
of felt like, oh, it's more the same, or I just wasn't different enough, or whoever, who knows. Um, and it's also important to have that level of perspective as well when it comes to doing really well in awards as well, because it's important not to let those get too uh to get too sort of big-headed from that as well, and sort of think like, okay, yeah, I'm really happy that I did so well at this competition, that I won G&B New Act competition, or that I'm in the final of Queer Vision, or whatever it might be. But if you sort of let that go, so therefore I am objectively a good comedian or whatever, it stops you from moving forwards and improving. And like you say, you might just relax too much and rest on that one good set that did really well. I remember I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan, and he in an interview said that he never has any awards in his house. He obviously, like, he's known for being one of the most, if not the most decorated musician in the history of the world, but he never actually sort of had those up in his house. If you look at, like, not necessarily to have a go, but by contrast, like Ricky Gervais, whenever he does a live sort of podcast or whatever, he's literally in front of his awards cabinet with full of BAFTAs and whatever, and that's his thing and
It's like
whatever.
Anne Hathaway at the Oscars,
Yeah.
carrying it around at the party.
And so, but the reason that Michael said that he didn't want to have awards in his house is because he didn't want to feel like he'd finished, like he'd done it. He always wanted to feel like he hadn't quite, there was still further to go and more to do, and because then you because what's the point? You might not, you won't innovate, you won't sort of test yourself, and I think that's a very good mindset, in that, because then also it's sort of like, what's the point if you consider, let's say, winning the Edinburgh Comedy Award, which is one of the biggest awards in the UK for, one of the, the best things that you could possibly have, I suppose, for a stand-up act at the Fringe. If you win that, like I'm a big fan of comedian John Robbins. He won that in 2017, I believe, or 2018, and he famously sort of jokes about the fact that that doesn't necessarily mean that he's sort of now suddenly really happy and everything's perfect and everything. Like, he still will have doubts about his act and his show and stuff. And so if you have something in your mind that that's the big thing, I've done this thing, then where do you go from there? As opposed to just sort of seeing it as just, oh, this is a lovely moment, and then you just keep moving forward. Going back to Pixar, one of my favourite Pixar films is Soul, and it's one that I think is so underrated. And one of the main sort of plot points of that is that the main character Joe, he finally gets to play alongside his like one of his musical heroes, and then he's sort of a bit disappointed afterwards because it's sort of like, oh, that's
Now
done
what?
now. I've done that
Yeah.
now. Like, but then he realizes, because throughout the whole film he's sort of pinned that as like that's his calling and whatever, but that's just like, well, you've done that now, so what's the point? Whereas actually the point of life isn't necessarily these individual milestones and events, because
Well, when
if
you
you pin,
complete life,
yeah,
you don't live
exactly.
anymore. So,
Exactly. So it's. I think it's really important for in both directions not pin too much on the successful competition for the sake of like, if you don't do it, then it's going to stop you from being too down on yourself. But if you do it, it's also going to stop you from being either big-headed and coming away from it being like, I'm objectively a good comedian and so therefore I don't need to try. And famously there's people that have done the same sets for 20 years because it works at the clubs or whatever. But if that's what they want to do, then that's up to them. But that's comedy is all about creativity. It's all about new ideas and sort of trying to come out of your comfort zone and thinking outside the box and all this sort of stuff. And so, yeah, I think it'd be a shame to feel like I'm done, I'm finished, I've found my 20-minute set that I know will work forever now. So yeah, I think competitions are great, but are just one aspect of
no, that's
the
like really,
industry.
yeah, that's a wonderful way to put it because I guess like if you see it as the end goal, I mean, there's a wider conversation here to, to touch on as well, is that like if that is just indicative of the fact that you've done it and you're finished, are you then ascribing your value to an external factor instead of kind of just like wanting to do comedy for the love of the game or because it is something that sets your soul on fire? And I guess which leads to my next question is like, what do you think separates those people, those artists who want that creative career versus the people who actually manage to sustain one?
I think that it's probably not to do with necessarily the creativity. It's sort of part of it is probably to do with accepting that it's like when people say, oh, if you find if you have a job that you love, then you'll never work a day in your life.
I think
And
that's
it's like,
bullshit.
that's what rubbish is that? Like, if you find the thing that you love, then you have to keep that job, you have to work so hard. And especially like with fighting against AI and all this sort of stuff, like even more so, you've got to work hard to sustain that job. And part of it is probably that sort of setting your soul on fire type thing. Sometimes that fire burns out and it fades, and you can get burnt out and you can lose the original love that you had. And I've had that definitely, and I've had it multiple times. And so sometimes it's just about like to
Mm.
rekindle that. It's about as I said before, revisiting what it is that made you that set your soul on fire in the first place, and sort of what is it about that thing that really spoke to you. And it's almost like I think there's something in like meditation or something like that's called a child's mind, and it's the
Mm.
idea of like approaching something as if it's your very first time doing
I
it.
love
And so
that.
when people sort of talk about meditation, sometimes they can get to a point where it's become so second nature, or it becomes so like they're so familiar with it that they're not really quite getting the benefits of it. Whereas a child's mind or child's approach to it is very much like, I'm trying this for the very first time, and sort of almost like tricking yourself into that you're doing, you're approaching it from scratch.
Mm.
And I think whether that be like the foundations of learning some of the very basics again, that you might feel, oh, I know that, I don't need to worry about that, but just like revisiting some of those, and
So
Yeah.
How do you maintain, I guess, that sense of wonderment? As you said, like this can be, like working as comedians or working as creatives, like this can be pretty fucking thankless and grueling. And sometimes we don't make that much money. And I mean, are you a freelancer? Can I confirm that,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I work freelance as well. So, you are your own boss, but on top of like not having the big brand and the big corporate to represent you, there's a lot of having to sell yourself in. So how do you maintain, I guess, that sense of like wonderment and don't get like jaded,
Yeah.
by the slog?
I think it's really important to do stuff without any pressure. So there's obviously like the main thing that's going to be getting me the money is the client projects that have the deadlines, that have a certain level of control, that things are out of your control. People have opinions or sort of requests or things that you would otherwise don't necessarily agree with, or you wouldn't necessarily
Mm,
choose yourself, and
mm,
so aren't always necessarily the most fun projects because you're having to do them for someone else.
yeah.
So I think it's really important to, whether it's with any creative medium, is always to do stuff for yourself as well, as the client projects. And that's difficult, obviously, finding the time to do that. But if
Yeah.
you're able to sort of set aside some time, it's like I said, it's almost like having that child's mind, that sort of playfulness with it,
Mm,
and sort of writing, whether it's writing jokes without necessarily this, you're not
mm,
writing for a specific gig that you've got coming up. You're just writing silly little puns or something that could be absolute rubbish, but it's they could unearth something that's like you're really proud of, or that is really nice. And it's silliness as well. If you're very sort of, if you're a comedian that is used to writing, I don't know, maybe like really hard-hitting satire, and that's very sort of deeply, maybe that's themed around politics, or is very sort of hard hit, like I say, hard hitting,
mm.
is like, I don't know, just exploring silly sort of childlike humour, or uh, just in your own time, just the drilling down to that, like I say, that sort of basic um, level of what is funny, or learning about other comedians, branching out to other styles that you're not used to. And
So
same
my
with that.
question, sorry, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, my question is then like, what was the last project that you did just for you? The last like creative thing that you did just for you,
Well,
whether
I
comedy
did.
or art or.
Well, I used to do. I'll get it. It's actually pinned up on the
Oh,
wall.
yay!
It's something that I used to do called Learn with Will. So
Okay.
this is before I was Willow, but it was a science communication series that was entirely sort of self-directed. I had lots of help with, like, I had a guy called Howard that did the music, and I had plenty of
Mm.
people that were helped me with scripts and were guest sort of characters and things. So there's some of the guest characters there, like
Oh, love that.
Lucy Rycroft Smith, who I did those math songs with recently, and
Mm.
Dr. Sheila Kanani, who's a sort of an astrophysicist. And uh, so there's plenty of people that have worked with me, but it's still it's my baby. It was very much my idea and something that I handled all by myself. And so it was very much uh, the thing that I sort of would always turn to when I either didn't have any client projects, or I just wanted a bit of a break from client work and just wanted to have some fun with it. And yeah, I got to sort of write really fun script story ideas, and I imagine there's a certain level of like script writing and sort of joke writing that I did on that has inspired my now stand up stuff. But yeah, that's the big one. I've not done it for a long time, and I don't know if I will revisit it, just because now comedy is it's sort of, comedy is almost the thing that I do just for me, because obviously I'm not doing it for money or anything.
Of course,
Um,
of course.
it's very much just like doing it for the passion. But yeah, who knows? Maybe Learn with will turn into Learn with Willow one day.
So one thing I've noticed though is like an element I've identified like just on your website, with Learn with Will, but also even like your stand-up comedy sets, you know, like where you kind of invite people into a world where they come away learning something, whether it's learning something about you, learning something about the trans community, learning something about science, about the world. Like, I feel like there's something there that, you know, that kind of speaks to you, that kind of like resonates across the ways you express yourself. Is there a particular, I guess, aspect of it that excites you?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think that it's one of those things where take like for example the trans experience. A lot of the negative aspects that that people, or the sort of the negativity that's faced directed towards trans people, a lot of it comes from a place of ignorance.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily that the people that hate trans people are inherently evil people. It's just that they don't understand what's going on, or they sort of, for example, there'll be the sort of stock line of like men are men, women are women. This is basic biology, and then if you look into it, it's not. It is basic biology in the sense that it's like the basic version of what we teach. What we're taught, because actually the truth is, what as with everything, the truth is way more complicated than that. Not only do intersex people exist, but there's an argument to be made where trans people that take hormones are changing their biology, and so are more biologically female or male, than they were when they were born. And so, I think a lot of the time it's just about like introducing this world, again, introducing this world almost from scratch. I'm sort of trying to say, you might have a view of what a trans person might be. I understand what a trans person looks like if you ask ChatGPT to generate one for you. I've got the blue hair, and that's the signature sort of non-binary thing. I've obviously got the pronouns. I'm going down the non-binary pipeline in that way. But other than that, this people don't realise, for example, the idea that like I identify as a trans femme non-binary person. What the hell does that mean? And you can just break it down as thinking, well, a non-binary person might consider themselves not necessarily on either extreme of male or female, and I sort of consider myself part of that. But I know that I'm definitely on the feminine side of that. Whereas there's some people that know they're like binary trans people, trans women, binary trans man, which means that they
Yes,
are
yes, yes.
man, woman, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I think that there's always going to be, no matter who you are, and no matter what you might have been taught when you were younger, or whatever idea you might have about learning, education, there's always going to be that sort of humans are hardwired to be curious and to learn and to pick up new information in order to survive. To learn that sound means there's danger around the corner. And so I think no matter who you are, there's always going to be, and you're always going to have a tiny bit of your brain that will be accepting of or receptive to new information. And so what I would love to do is to just be able to tap into that, and to there's humor. Obviously, the main purpose of it may be more actually to have a laugh rather than to come away as if it's a lecture. Or if it's my animated videos, learning might be the primary thing, and the humour might be secondary to that. But I think that it's sort of tapping into, like, not only we're going to have a laugh, but it'd be nice to come away from something, understanding something a little bit more. And as I say, once you understand something a bit more, that's where you can find it funny, and not laugh at, but laugh with.
And there's something very beautiful, I think, about the fact that laughter, again, they say laughter is the shortest distance between two strangers. And, I think comedy puts us in this unique position to create that connection between people and concepts, like, that they might really not have had an affinity for or just understood. And I do believe, like, there's really something there to be said. We are gonna go over a little bit because I've had so much fun talking to you, but like, okay, so speaking of, I guess, like, teaching people, speaking of like what people can learn. Um, to young comics who are aspiring to get into stand up, or comedy curious people, or even like maybe to artists like who want to get into animation or design, like to these aspiring creatives, what advice would you give to them?
So it's a sort of theme that I've already touched on, I suppose, but it's like always sort of remember where remember what set your soul on fire is always a big thing, especially with like animation. What about those films that you loved? What do you love about them? And keep that close to you, because there's going to be times where you lose hope or that you just lose motivation, and that's where having that close helps to revisit the
Mm.
initial spark that um, to remind yourself why you fell in love with it in the first place. Similarly with comedy, having maybe it's certain people that got you into it, and because ultimately I think stand-up comedy is the sort of thing that is most people's experience of one realizing they wanted to do stand-up comedy is seeing someone else do it and just go, that could be me, I could do that. And that's such a lovely thing to have, and so to hold on to that and to remember that you had that initial spark. I think, as with a lot of things, research and learning, trying to branch out into different aspects. I mean, both comedy and animation inherently have different techniques and different ways of approaching it. With like animation, there's not one version of that. You can do stop motion, 2D animation, 3D animation, projection mapping, all these different types of things. And with comedy, I do, we both do stand up generally, but there's obviously character comedy, musical comedy, slapstick, drag, all these different ways of doing comedy. And so that you can find your world within that. And that can be another thing that helps you to get fully inspired. But then also, if you found that, then having the openness to try something new, and especially if you're losing that motivation, well, maybe swap it up and try create a character. If you're used to doing a version of yourself on stage in stand up, try a brand new character, and just try and look at it from a slightly new perspective. And then it's always difficult, because there's obviously specific ways of like, okay, the best thing for comedy is you need to do a gong show, and then you need to at that gong show make sure you speak to the promoter, and all these sort of very specific things, which are true but then also vary, because there's so many different routes to get into animation, so many different routes to get into stand-up comedy. There'll be plenty of people that say you should host your own night, you should MC your own night, and that will help you learn different aspects of it. Plenty of people that have never done that and never will, and that will still be successful. So I think it's all the basics. It's all about just sort of tapping into what you fell in love with, how you fell in love with it in the first place, but also allowing yourself time away from it. And just approaching it with that childlike, playful mind, and not necessarily trying not to get too bogged down into the I've got a gig tomorrow, and sort of mind that's maybe holding you back a bit.
Okay, so I have two more questions before we wrap up. One is, what is the last thing that like really inspired you?
It's a very good question. I think that my wife and I have actually been doing we've been watching the Pixar films from the start. Keep going on about Pixar, but it's always going to have a special place in our heart. And there's so many, like Soul, for example. There's so many of those films where there's moments that are just I love the most in animation. I think, especially with like Pixar films, is when they break out of they do some. There's one scene or something where they do something slightly different. Like, for example, in the original Inside Out film, they go through a shortcut which where they started to get abstracted, and so they start off as their normal
Yes.
characters, but then they turn into these blocky versions, and then they
They're like falling
ultimately,
apart.
yeah, and they ultimately turn into just a singular shape.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that's sort of like, oh wow, that's so cool that they're sort of taking a risk like that. And then similarly, there's a moment in Soul where Joe gets so lost in his piano solo that he sort of drifts off, and it's these beautiful abstract colours.
Mm.
And yeah, I think that there's been so many examples of those that have been revisiting those has been really lovely. I mean, there's always certain music and things that inspire you. It's always difficult to, because inspiration could be like, oh, that has given me the idea for this specific thing, or it can just be, it just, like you say, sets your soul on fire, or just you're like, oh, this is why I love music, this is why I love comedy, or whatever. One of my favorite live action film is Blade Runner. It's my favorite film of all time, Blade Runner.
Oh my God,
Uh,
you're gonna have a lot to talk about with my husband and me.
I listened to the soundtrack the other day on a train journey, and it was just absolutely. It was the train journey to come to Bitch and Stitch, actually.
Amazing.
Um, and I listened to that whole thing, and it's just my favorite soundtrack as well. So wonderful. And yeah, so there's lots of different things recently that have inspired me. It's difficult to pick just one.
Okay, so final question. Um, if you were visited by Willow as a child, by little Willow, past Willow, and said, and they said to you, I'm just really, curious. What's my life going to be like? And you had a sentence to tell them.
um, I'm actually about to write today. I'm writing a bit about my photo shoot that I mentioned last time, and one of the sort of the approaches that I'm going to have is like, I grew up feeling like I wasn't like attractive, or I wasn't desired by whatever it might be, and or I wasn't cool. And now, like, and there'll be plenty of people that totally disagree, but there's so many people that think I'm one of the coolest people ever. And so it's like, you are cool. You are cool. You are loved. You've got a wonderful wife. You're, those thoughts that you had about wanting to be a girl, and then you did something about that, or are doing something about that. And you are happier than you are as a little kid. So just be patient, and you know everything starts to fall into place.
I love that. Well, oh my gosh, we look at this time. We've gone over, but this was wonderful. Again, I love talking to you. Thank you for taking, some time in your morning to yap with me. And
Thank you for letting
again,
me.
yeah, thanks to everybody who tuned in. Again, I will put this on the Substack, and yeah, I will see you for our gig like in a couple of weeks. So
Yeah,
take
can't
care.
wait.
Bye.
Bye
Take care.
bye.
Bye.